Abolitionist for Everybody is a podcast that tackles the sometimes difficult conversations around prison abolition. I'm Crystal.
And I'm Graham. This season is about the media's involvement in carceral or abolitionist thinking.
How it uses narratives to impact, radicalize, and shift culture.
Just a reminder, friends, though the title of this episode may give you some warning, remember that harm itself tends to create situations of alternate harms.
There will likely be other painful topics brought up too. Take care of you.
Welcome back to another episode of Abolition is for Everybody. This episode, we're going to be talking about gangs and immigration. Before we get started, we wanted to mention that we've lumped these two really different topics together. Simply put, we're highlighting how they are often conflated in the media to help sensationalize stories despite the reality of the situation. And we have a guest to help us talk through it. Welcome, Valerie. Thank you for being with us. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I am a born and raised Angelino. I'm also a public school teacher, and I am an active community member and abolitionist myself.
Thank you so much for being here, Val. I have, had the honor of witnessing your activism in our community. For our listeners, can you tell them a little bit more about how you're connected to the topic of immigration and gangs?
Yes, of course. So I'm also system impacted. I have a loved one inside, and they also have a status of not a legal status. So when we talk about immigration, there are consequences that are unforeseen, and we're waiting to see what's going to happen.
I know a lot of our listeners are being introduced to a lot of terminology this season, and really all seasons. Can you describe a little bit more what that status looks like for your loved one who is incarcerated? I don't think a lot of people know what happens once they finish their prison term, like what comes after that.
So when someone serves their time and completes their time and they go through the parole board system, and one of the questions will come up is, does this individual have an ICE hold? And right away, if you're familiar with ICE, that means that as soon as that person is deemed eligible for parole, they jumped all these hoops and they're deemed an amazing person and they are eligible for parole. They still have that ICE hold, and that means ICE, the second they are released, will be transferred directly into ICE. And after that, lots of people disappear. I mean, it's a scary situation because at least I can receive a phone call, write, or even visit my loved one inside in a California institution. But once they're transferred to ICE, they can leave the state, go to Louisiana, be transferred anywhere in this nation to an ICE facility. So when you talk about immigration status, if you're a resident, if you commit a crime, you lose that residency status. So you become just undocumented is your label, and you will have an ICE hold on your record.
So when they are transferred to the ICE detention centers or facilities, what's the process then? Like, do they go through a lengthy court process? Are they able to call home then? Like, what are some of the things that they do have versus what they do not have?
So from what I understand, because my loved one isn't in that stage yet, but what I've heard from other people is they're waiting there, and they can wait forever long. It could be indefinite to see a judge. And at that point, a judge will ask if you want to fight your ICE hold or be deported. So we will be facing two decisions. And a lot of families who lived here in this country, they call this country home, and they don't know anything else. You have to make that decision right then and there. Do I want to fight this and stay basically incarcerated for an indefinite time, or be or be deported and leave to an unfamiliar country with no supports there?
Wow.
When you use the words indefinite and forever, that is so scary because there's just like no end in sight. And you basically go from being incarcerated to being incarcerated. right off the bat. I actually did not know that once somebody gets transferred to ICE hold, that you kind of lose touch and connections with your loved one, and that they can be sent anywhere in the US. Part of my job is that I read thousands of letters from folks who are incarcerated throughout the state of California. And lately I've been getting more and more letters just pleading for help from folks who are ready to come home, and excited, to rejoin their community, but they found out that they're going straight to an ICE hold. Some folks write that they've been in this country since they were children. Some don't even know the language of the country that they're getting sent to. So I think the more that I learn about this, the scarier the process sounds. And I'm really curious to know, Val, what is one thing, because I know that the media does such a great job at scaring people, and using words like illegal aliens to describe our community. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts there, having, a loved one who is undocumented? What are the things that you see in the media, and what are the things that you wish, were shared instead?
Well, the one thing the media lacks is a human aspect, the human story. We're called undocumented. I mean, how far removed from an actual person, a human being, is that? And when we're talking about these undocumented, quote unquote, undocumented people, we're talking about men, women, domestic violence survivors, refugees, veterans. These are who we're sending away. We're punishing them twice, and we're separating them from their only home. I know so many stories of people that came here as infants. They owned and served over 2 decades. They went to ICE and they couldn't serve their time. They couldn't take it. They can do over 2 decades in a California facility, and they found healing and rehabilitation and were found commutable by a previous governor, passed their board, made all those steps of progress in their life, and then were just released and snatched up, kidnapped by ICE. And she was later, separated by any communication from her family. She didn't know what was happening. They don't know anything. At least when you're in a California facility, you know your sentence, you know what you can do to get out and work toward progress. But when you're in ICE, there's no progress to make. One day this country's going to say, you're out of here, and that's it. You don't get to plead your case. You do get to plead a case, but it's most likely going to be a deportation.
And you hear like zero reporting on that. Graham, I know that sparked a thought in you, but before we move further, Val, I want to check in with you. Is there a better term to use than undocumented? Because very, very early on, I learned don't use illegal alien, but this is the first time, to be honest, that I hear undocumented also removes the humanity and the empathy from folks.
Well, I always like to say, these are community members that do not have a legal status. And some actually do have their residency. They have a green card and a residency, but as soon as you commit a felony, those titles are stripped, because that is considered a privilege.
That's super tragic. And I think in terms of the way that the media represents this, or the fact that they don't show these stories, is because there's no hook. We know that the media is heavy on hooks, and there's really no hook, because the public opinion, just based on what the media has fed them historically, is that once you commit an act of harm or a crime, a felony in this case, like, you get what you get. And so the public opinion would not bite into the story, so the media doesn't cover it. But it's clear from the way that you've described it that these people without legal status, that there's a story that should be told and represented, so that this act of harm that's being done to them could be undone.
Yes, I mean, it's so true. I mean, most of the women that are incarcerated have also experienced domestic violence. They're domestic violence survivors. We're punishing them twice. They're doing their what we call penance and serving their time. But then after that, they're deported, they're separated from their only family, their loved ones, their community, to a country that they probably haven't been since they were minors. What connection and what kind of support do they face there? Do they even have, some of these people have never, like you said before, don't speak the language. We have every immigrant we can talk about from Asia, Southeast Asian, from Africa, from all of Latin America, South America, everywhere, being deported to places they don't feel safe in because they left the country as refugees, countries with their own gang problem. And if they go to get deported, we're endangering people by sending them back to a country they have no connection to or support there. No one talks about the dangers about deportation.
I think one of the most heartbreaking things, when it comes to this topic is the missed opportunities that we have before incarceration and then after incarceration or after somebody gets deported. I was watching a video by John Oliver on YouTube where he talks about immigration. And in that video, he shared of a mom who was separated from her child at the border. And they were separated for so long that the little boy was crying as he said, "I want to go back to the jail. You're not my mom anymore. I don't recognize you. I want to go." He was pleading to go back to the jail, and all the trauma that the child went through, all the trauma that the mom has went through. It's like, yeah, they're reunited. But look at the trauma that we have put into their lives. And at the end of the video, John Oliver pauses and says, "We did that. We made that happen. We put that trauma in that family." And it's just so heartbreaking to think of the different ways that we are just naturally complicit in this, because the media and politicians do such a good job at scaring us and using words that scare us from these community members. So as someone who comes from a Latino community and a community that's full of quote unquote gangs, I always see just how inaccurate the representation of our communities is.
So I have a question, kind of a question commentary. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So the media covers this from a specific angle, and it informs the public, and the politicians inform the media as to the angle to cover. So we hear about like border surges, we hear about terms like anchor baby, we hear things like that. And the media covers it all from a problem solution approach. Like, oh, here's the problem, and the politicians will come up with a solution. Now, my opinion, and I wonder if you agree on this, is that, and this comes from my personal experience, being previously incarcerated, being a gang member. Like, I think that the real solution is in asking why. Like, why are there surges at the border? Like, why is this an avenue that people will use to come into the country? And it comes a lot with what you mentioned in terms of the issues that are taking place, the community issues that are taking place, the danger that's taking place in the countries of origin. But I'm wondering if you agree with what I'm saying. Like, if you ask why, I know for me, I got gang involved. I became gang involved and did the things that I did that eventually landed me in prison for a lengthy period of time, because there was trauma in my life. There was experiences in my life that I didn't have the tools nor coping mechanisms to deal with. It was a very dangerous place in my house, so I went out to the streets. It was a very dangerous place in the streets, so I did what I had to do to survive, so on and so forth, ad infinitum or nauseam to prison. And so, like, I think that asking why can be a solution here, and I wonder what you think about that.
I see how your story parallels to a lot of refugee stories that are here, that are being deported. They escape a country with their family to here for opportunity to feel safe. They have no choice. You have no choice but to leave for a better life for your family here. And even here, there are dangers that some communities cannot face, because you probably, as an immigrant, you want to feel safe and you go to a known community. But even within those communities, gangs are there. So our children, our youth are vulnerable in those situations. They grow up in that, in possibly gangs, and it's circular. So, I mean, the trauma we're creating by deporting is not a solution to helping these individuals that had left a country for safety, and then we're going to send them back. It's circular to me.
Absolutely. And I think like the narrative, the media narrative and the social narrative on gangs also is corrupted. It's not entirely accurate. It's flawed. Like gangs are communities. I've often said, just based on what I've seen in my lived experience, that without toxic masculinity and patriarchy, a gang is just a community network. It's a group of people who band together and deal with the absence of certain aspects. One would call it entitlements, other people would call it privilege, but like the lack of access to certain things, and they deal with those things within their community with the lack of resources, emotional and otherwise, that they can. Like, so a gang is just a network of people without patriarchy and toxic masculinity. It's essentially harmless. It's really just doing what it can to band a community of people together.
That makes sense because how I mentioned before, I did grow up in a community that has gangs and, Latino community. And I didn't realize just how badly the media was portraying gangs or communities with gangs until my brother's incarceration a couple of years ago. Because the way that I grew up was, this is a community that is trying to survive. This is a community that is constantly harassed by the cops. We are poor, we are broke. A lot of us don't know the language. A lot of us in this general community are community members that don't have legal status. And it reminds me of one time where I would walk home from the bus stop in high school, and an individual would follow me and take pictures with me and do sexual things in his car. And I remember that I took out $1 and wrote their license plate. And as soon as I got home, it wasn't the first time it happened. Didn't want to call the cops because usually they don't do anything. But that time he freaked me out to the point where I called as soon as I got home. The 2 white police officers came and nothing happened. Nothing happened. So then I told my loved one, who told his friends, and I was safe from then on because they would walk me home. And these are the kind of things that the media doesn't portray. The sense of community, us just wanting to survive, and we're dealt with systems that are meant to see us fail. And unfortunately, when we don't quote unquote make it, they just criminalize us and incarcerate us. So it's no surprise that we have our little pods out here and we have our pods in prisons as well. I've never been incarcerated, Graham, so you can go ahead and talk about this more. But pods exist inside and outside of prisons so that we can survive and hopefully thrive in an America that wants to see us fail and sent back to our countries.
I think you touch a lot of important topics, and I think I'm just reflecting a lot, but it's just ironic that this country is built on immigrant thoughts, immigrant communities, and also enslaved people. We're labor, but yet we don't want immigrants here, and we don't welcome them, and we don't give second chances to immigrants. I think of how our law reflects that, and it's funny that we can take certain things from immigrants, but then we can push back and be like, we don't want this, and this in our, so we reject. If we don't fit the model minority, you're not embraced in our country.
What does the model minority look like? What does that mean?
The model minority is like the immigrant that follows all the directions, follows all the laws, succeeds in life, is a contributing member